There is a particular kind of stillness that belongs to the edge of a river, not the stillness of a closed room or the quiet of a house when everyone has settled for the night. This is a wider stillness, the kind that opens outward along both banks, that carries the sound of moving water through it, the way cloth carries its color. The river sounds different at the edge than it does from a distance. You can hear its depth. You can hear its intention. This is a peaceful story from the ancient scriptures, set aside for the quiet hours of night. Let it carry you gently toward rest. The people of Israel stood at the edge of a river. The river was the Jordan, not the widest river in the world or the longest, but this river, this specific river running in its valley between the hills of Transjordan to the east and the highlands of Canaan to the west. A river that had been, for all of their 40 years in the wilderness, on the other side of everything they were moving toward. A river that had been the boundary between the journeying and the arriving, and now they were here, at its bank. Behind them were the plains of Moab, the wide, flat grasslands east of the Jordan, where they had been camped through the final weeks of the long wilderness journey. Behind the plains of Moab was the wilderness, stretching all the way back to Sinai. Behind the wilderness was Egypt, the country they had left so long ago that most of the people now standing at the river had never seen it. Ahead of them was the water, and beyond the water, the land. 40 years, a generation had been born in the wilderness and grown up in it. They had known no other home. The wilderness was where they had eaten manna and seen the cloud move and celebrated the Sabbath and heard the stories told by the elders. The stories of Egypt and the crossing of the sea and the mountain and the covenant. They had grown up carrying these stories as their inheritance, having never seen the events the stories described. And the generation that had left Egypt, that had walked through the parted sea and stood at the foot of Sinai and trembled when the ground shook, most of that generation had died in the wilderness. The 40 years had been long enough to pass a torch. The ones who would enter the land were, in a large part, the children of the ones who had left Egypt, children who were now adults, standing at the river's edge, ready for what their parents had been promised. Moses himself had not entered. He had died on the far side of the Jordan, on Mount Nebo, the ancient text says, where he had been shown the whole extent of the land from its northern reaches to its southern limits. He had seen it. He had died with the sight of it in his eyes. And now another would lead the people through. His name was Joshua, in Hebrew Yehoshua, a name that carries within it the meaning of the Lord saves, or the Lord is salvation. It was a name that described a reality before the reality had fully arrived. He had been Moses' attendant for many years, the one who accompanied Moses on parts of the mountain journey, who served the leader of the people in the capacity of a close assistant. He had been with Caleb, one of the 2 spies who had returned from scouting the Promised Land 40 years earlier with a different kind of report than the other 10. When the others had seen the difficulty of the land and been afraid, Joshua and Caleb had seen the same land and believed it was possible. They had been willing to go, and that willingness, held across 40 years of wilderness waiting, now brought Joshua to this moment. He was Moses' successor, chosen and designated, the one God had said would lead the people into the land, the one who would finish the journey that Moses had begun. He was, by this point, not a young man. He had spent most of his adult life in the wilderness. He knew the people. He knew the land from the one expedition he had made into it. And he knew, in the way that a long life in the wilderness teaches a person to know things, how to attend and how to wait, and how to move when the time for moving came. The time had come. In the days after Moses died, the ancient account says, the word of the Lord came to Joshua, not slowly, not tentatively, not with qualifications, directly, and with a quality that the ancient text communicates through its structure as much as through its content. Moses, my servant, has died. Now therefore arise. Cross this Jordan, you and all this people, into the land that I am giving them. And then a description of the land, its extent, its boundaries, the sweep of it from the wilderness in the south to the great river in the north, from the sea in the west to the far eastern reaches. Every place the sole of your foot will tread, the word said, I have given you. And then, woven through the word, threaded through all the specific details of geography and command, a repetition that became, in its repetition, almost like a rhythm, almost like breathing. Be strong and courageous. The phrase came several times in the word to Joshua, not because Joshua was obviously weak or fearful, but because the weight of what was before him was genuinely large, and the ancient word understood that. Be strong and courageous, for you shall cause this people to inherit the land. Be strong and courageous, do not be frightened or dismayed. Be strong and courageous, and with it, each time, I will be with you. The promise that had been given to Moses at the burning bush, I will be with you, was given again here to Moses' successor. The same promise, the same presence, the same assurance that the one leading the people was not leading alone, was not finding the way by personal ingenuity or strength, was not doing this on the basis of personal qualification. I will not leave you or forsake you. This is one of the oldest and most persistent phrases in all the ancient scriptures, a phrase that appears again and again in different situations and to different people, always carrying the same fundamental weight. Whatever else is true, and however difficult the road ahead, this is also true. The one who made the covenant keeps it. The one who sent has not sent and then departed. The one who calls accompanies. Joshua received the word, and then he rose and went to work. Joshua gave the officers of the people a command. Pass through the camp, he told them, and tell the people, prepare your provisions. Within 3 days, we will cross this Jordan and go in to take possession of the land that the Lord your God is giving you. 3 days, the interval that recurs in these ancient accounts of preparation, the space before a threshold, the pause before the crossing. 3 days in which to gather what was needed, to make ready, to orient the attention toward what was coming. The people began their preparations, and Joshua also attended to another matter, one that touched on the history of the land and the people's relationships within it. He summoned the leaders of the tribes of Reuben and Gad and the half-tribe of Manasseh. These tribes had already received their allotted territory on the east side of the Jordan, the land on this side of the river before the crossing. They had made their homes there, settled their families, established their flocks. They were, in one sense, already in possession of what had been given them. But Joshua reminded them of the commitment they had made to Moses. Your wives, your children, your livestock may remain in the land east of the Jordan, he said. But you, your fighting men, must cross over ahead of your kinsmen and help them until the Lord gives them rest, as he has given you rest, and they also have taken possession of their land. Rest. The word rests in the sentence as deliberately as the thing itself. Rest is what they had received on the east side of the river. Rest is what the other tribes had not yet received, and the promise of the word to Joshua, the goal toward which the crossing was moving, was rest for all the people. The leaders of the eastern tribes answered Joshua. They said, "Just as we obeyed Moses in everything, so we will obey you. Wherever you send us, we will go. Only may the Lord your God be with you, as he was with Moses." It was an acknowledgement and a prayer simultaneously, the recognition of what Joshua would need, and the expression of hope that it would be given. And then they said, "Be strong and courageous." The same phrase that God had spoken to Joshua now came back from the people, offered to their leader, reflected toward him from those he would lead. What had been given from above was now also given from below. The word of encouragement had circled. Before the 3 days were complete, before the crossing began, Joshua sent 2 spies. "Go," he told them. "Look over the land, and especially Jericho." Jericho was the first city they would encounter after crossing the Jordan, a city that sat in the valley just west of the river, in the wide flat plain below the highlands of Canaan. It was an ancient place, one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities in the world, surrounded by its walls, positioned at the threshold of the land. The 2 spies crossed the river and came to Jericho. They came to the house of a woman named Rahab and lodged there. Rahab is one of the more remarkable figures in the book of Joshua, a woman of Jericho, not an Israelite, who hid the spies when the king of the city sent men to find them, who lowered them by a rope through a window in the city wall at night and sent them back toward the Jordan, and who, in the course of her hiding them, told them something that the spies carried back to Joshua. She told them that the people of Jericho had heard what happened, the crossing of the sea, the long wilderness journey, the victories east of the Jordan. All of it had traveled across the distance and had arrived in Jericho, and the people had heard, and their hearts had melted. She said, "The Lord your God is God in heaven above and on earth beneath." These words, from a woman of Jericho, from outside the covenant community, spoken to the spies of the people she had chosen to shelter. These words are among the most remarkable in the early part of Joshua's story. A confession of faith, offered not by an Israelite in the camp, but by a Canaanite woman in the city that was the first obstacle of the conquest. She had heard, she had weighed what she heard, and she had arrived at a conclusion that she expressed plainly. The Lord is God, above and below, encompassing everything. And then she asked for something. She had protected the spies. She asked that they protect her and her family when the Israelites came to the city. She asked for a sign of faithfulness, a token of the promise. The spies gave her a scarlet cord to hang from the window through which she had lowered them, a visible marker, something the approaching Israelites could see, a sign that this house was to be spared. The spies made the agreement and went back across the Jordan to Joshua. They told him everything, and they told him what Rahab had told them. The people of the land are afraid. Their hearts have melted. The land was before them. On the 3rd morning, the people broke camp and came to the Jordan. The Jordan in this season, the text specifies that it was the season of harvest, the time of the spring floods, when the snow melt from the mountains north of the Sea of Galilee, fills the river above its ordinary banks, was running at its fullest. Not a crossing easily made, not shallow. The river was bank to bank with moving water, more than it would be at any other time of year. The people saw it. They camped beside it. And then Joshua gave the officers another instruction, and the officers went through the camp with it. "Watch for the ark of the covenant of the Lord your God," they said. "When you see the priests carrying it, move out from your positions and follow it, though keep a distance of about 1,000 yards between you and it. Do not come close to it, so that you know which way to go, because you have not passed this way before. You have not passed this way before." This single phrase carries something quiet and true in it. The way was unknown. The route had not been traveled by these people or by anyone they knew. There was no map, no record, no memory of crossing this specific river at this specific time in this specific place, carrying this covenant, entering this land. It was entirely new. And because it was new, because there was no path from experience, the ark went first. The presence, carried in the chest, borne on the shoulders of the priests, going before, would show the way. Joshua spoke to the people. "Consecrate yourselves," he told them, "for tomorrow the Lord will do wonders among you." Consecration again, the preparation of the inner person before a threshold event, the washing and the setting apart, the orientation of the attention toward what was coming. Tomorrow, something would happen tomorrow that had not happened before. Wonders. The word in the ancient text carries the connotation of something extraordinary, something that breaks the ordinary expectation of events. The people consecrated themselves. The night before the crossing, they prepared, and Joshua told the priests, "Take up the ark of the covenant and pass on before the people." On that morning, the morning the people would cross, the priests lifted the ark. They had done this many times across the 40 years of wilderness journeying. The ark had traveled whenever the camp moved, carried on the long poles that fitted through the permanent rings in its sides, borne on the shoulders of the Levites designated for this task. They had carried it through desert and mountain pass and open plain. This was the work they knew. They carried it forward to the edge of the Jordan. And then, as they came to the water, as the feet of the priests who carried the ark touched the edge of the flowing water, the river stopped. The ancient account describes it matter-of-factly, in the way that this account describes all of its extraordinary events. The waters coming down from above stood and rose up in a heap, at a great distance upstream, at a city called Adam, and the waters flowing down to the sea of the Arabah, the Dead Sea, were completely cut off, and the people passed over on dry ground. Dry ground, the same phrase used for the crossing of the sea 40 years before. Dry ground in a river that had been full and overflowing. A path through the middle, as there had been a path through the middle of the sea. The priest stood in the middle of the Jordan, on the dry ground, holding the ark, and all Israel passed over on dry ground until all the people had crossed. There is a stillness in this image that is worth holding gently. The priests standing in the dry bed of the Jordan, the ark on their shoulders, the water standing back. The whole community of Israel, all the tribes, all the households, all the children and the elderly and the animals and all the household goods, crossing past them, one family at a time, crossing the river on ground that should not have been walkable. And the priests standing still, they did not cross with the first group and then come back. They did not move with the flow of people. They stood in the middle, in the dry bed of the river, on the ground where the water had been, between the people moving past on both sides, and they held the ark. They stood until everyone had crossed, every person, every animal, every household, until the whole community of Israel was on the western bank, on the soil of the promised land for the first time. And only then, the ancient account says, did the priest come up out of the riverbed. Only when the last of the people had crossed and Joshua gave the word, did the priest carry the ark up from the Jordan. And as soon as the soles of their feet touched the western bank, the waters returned. The river resumed its full flow, running again bank to bank as it had been. Before the priest came up out of the river, Joshua did something. He had already, on the night before, told 12 men what they were to do, one man from each tribe. He told them, "When you cross the Jordan, take up a stone from the middle of the riverbed, from where the priests are standing, and carry it over with you, and set it down in the place where you camp tonight. 12 stones, one for each tribe, carried out of the dry bed of the river by the representatives of each of the 12 families of Israel, carried over to the western bank, to the first camp in the land. There was also a second set of stones, 12 stones that Joshua himself set up in the middle of the Jordan, in the place where the priests had stood. These would remain under the water when the river returned to its channel, invisible, known only to those who knew they were there. The 12 stones carried to the western bank were set up as a memorial. At their first camp, called Gilgal, Joshua arranged the 12 stones from the riverbed and spoke to the people about them. In the future, he said, when your children ask their parents, "What do these stones mean?" you will tell them, "The Jordan's waters were cut off before the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord. When it crossed the Jordan, the waters were cut off. These stones are to be a memorial for the people of Israel forever. 12 stones from a river, not sculpted, not engraved, not transformed from what they were, just stones, taken from the place where the crossing happened, unremarkable in themselves, their significance entirely in where they had come from and what had happened there." The ancient world understood the power of physical reminders, of objects that could be pointed to, touched, shown to children, that carried in their physical presence the memory of an event that might otherwise fade in the telling. The stones at Gilgal would stand there, arranged in whatever configuration Joshua placed them, through the years and generations that followed. They would be there when the children grew up and brought their own children, and their children brought their children. What do these stones mean? The question would be asked, and the answer would be given, and the crossing would be told again. And the telling would keep the memory alive in the way that telling always keeps memories alive, renewed by each repetition, carried by each new voice, given to each new generation. The first camp was called Gilgal. The name came from the rolling away of reproach, a name given to the place by the event that happened there. Before the people could move further into the land, there was something to attend to. The generation born in the wilderness had not been circumcised. The rite that marked belonging to the covenant community had not been practiced during the 40 years of wandering. At Gilgal, this was remedied. The people stayed at Gilgal, and they healed. The ancient account notes simply that they remained in the camp until they were healed. A period of recovery, of quiet, of the camp at rest, while the people recovered from this act of covenant renewal. Not marching, not advancing, resting in the land they had crossed the river to reach. This is worth holding for a moment. The very first thing they did in the promised land, after the 12 stones were set up, was rest, stay, remain, not press forward, not establish military advantage, not survey and plan, heal, be still, let the body recover from what had been done to it, rest at the threshold of everything. And at Gilgal, they also celebrated the Passover. On the 14th day of the first month, in the plains of Jericho, they kept the Passover, the memorial of the night they had left Egypt, the night of watching, the night of the Exodus, 40 years after the first Passover. In the land they had been traveling toward since that original night, they ate unleavened bread. They ate the grain of the land, the produce of the land of Canaan, grown in the soil of the promised land, harvested and prepared and eaten by people who were, for the first time, in the place where the food grew. And the ancient account notes something almost quietly extraordinary. On the day after the Passover, when they ate the grain of the land, the manna stopped. 40 years of manna, 40 years of the small white substance on the ground each morning, gathered by hand, ground and baked and eaten. The provision that had sustained the entire wilderness generation, that had come with the dew every morning without fail for 40 years, ceased, because there was grain now, because the land provided, because the provision that the wilderness required was no longer needed. The manna stopped, and the people ate the food of the land of Canaan. Near Jericho, in the days of preparation, Joshua looked up and saw a man standing before him with a drawn sword. This is one of the more unexpected moments in the first chapters of Joshua. A figure encountered not in a dream or a vision, but in the waking world, standing with a weapon near the city that was the first obstacle before the people. Joshua walked toward him. He asked, "Are you for us or for our enemies?" The answer was neither. "No," said the figure. "I am the commander of the army of the Lord. Now I have come." Joshua fell face down to the ground and asked, "What does my Lord say to his servant?" And the commander said, "Take off your sandals from your feet, for the place where you are standing is holy." The same instruction that had come to Moses at the burning bush, the same gesture of approaching holy ground, the removal of what separates the feet from the earth. And here, in the plain before Jericho, not on a mountain, not in a wilderness of unusual drama, the ground was holy, the place was set apart, the threshold of the land was sacred. Joshua removed his sandals, and he listened. This encounter, brief, simply told, not elaborated upon by the ancient text, does something quiet and important in the structure of the story. It establishes Joshua's leadership, not on his own authority or his own military genius, but on his willingness to fall to the ground and ask, "What do you say to your servant? What are your instructions?" He was the leader of the people, and he fell down before one who was greater than him. He received the instruction rather than inventing it. He removed his sandals on holy ground rather than standing confident on his own accomplishment. This is the posture that runs through the Joshua story. The leader who acts, but acts in response to what he receives, who asks for the way rather than choosing it himself, whose strength and courage are real, but whose direction comes from beyond him. Remove your sandals. The ground is holy. Joshua removed them and went on to receive what he needed. The crossing was the beginning, not the end. After Gilgal, after the Passover, after the manna stopped and the grain of the land was eaten, the people began the work of taking possession of what had been promised. This is the larger story of the book of Joshua, and it is a long and complex story, full of details that belong to a different kind of telling than a peaceful bedtime narrative. But the broad shape of it can be held gently and simply. The people moved into the land, battle by battle, city by city, region by region, not all at once and not without difficulty. The land was inhabited, and the people who lived there did not simply make way. There were campaigns in the south and campaigns in the north, alliances and confrontations, victories and moments of failure when the people did not do as they had been instructed. The ancient text tells all of this honestly: the faithfulness and the failure, the obedience and the lapses. The book of Joshua is not a story of perfect people doing everything right. It is a story of a community learning imperfectly and persistently how to inhabit a land that was given to them by promise rather than earned by their own merit. Years passed, the work was long, and then, toward the end of the book of Joshua, in a passage that gathers up the whole of everything that has occurred, the ancient account pauses and says something extraordinary in its quietness. The Lord gave to Israel all the land that he swore to give to their fathers, and they took possession of it, and they settled there. All the land, given, taken possession of, settled. Not perfectly settled. There were still peoples living in various parts of the land, and the work of full inhabitation would continue beyond Joshua's lifetime. The ancient text acknowledges this complexity elsewhere. But in this gathering moment, the ancient account looks back at the whole arc of what has happened and says, the promise was fulfilled. What was sworn to Abraham generations ago came true. And then the ancient text adds something that has stayed in the world's memory for the way it is said. Not one word of all the good things that the Lord had spoken to the house of Israel had failed. All came to pass. Not one word. The promise made to Abraham long centuries before, I will give this land to your offspring. The word given to Moses on the mountain. The word given to Joshua at the river. All the individual assurances along the way, spoken in specific moments to specific people, about a specific future that had not yet arrived. Not one of them had failed. All had come to pass. The phrase is worth letting rest in the imagination for a moment, because it carries a weight that is easy to miss in a quick reading. The distance between the promise and its fulfillment was enormous. Abraham had received the promise and died without seeing the land. Isaac and Jacob had received it and died in exile. The whole Israelite community had spent 400 years in Egypt, and then 40 years in the wilderness, and only now, only here, in the time of Joshua, was the promise reaching its fulfillment. Hundreds of years, generations, people who had received the promise and died holding it, who had passed it to their children, who had passed it to their children, who had passed it on again, until the generation that stood on the western bank of the Jordan and set their feet on the soil of the land. Not one word had failed, despite the length of time, despite the difficulty of the journey, despite the generations of waiting and the moments of wavering and the long, slow accumulation of years between the giving and the receiving. The words were kept, all of them. The ancient account adds one more thing, and then is quiet. And the Lord gave them rest on every side, just as he had sworn to their fathers. Not one of all their enemies had withstood them, for the Lord had given all their enemies into their hands. Rest. This word, rest, in its Hebrew form menuha, carries within it something larger than the cessation of warfare. It is related to the same root as Sabbath rest. It is the rest of completion, of arrival, of having come to the place you are meant to come to and being settled there. Not the rest of exhaustion or the rest of temporary pause, the rest of those who have reached the other side. The people who had been wandering were no longer wandering. The people who had been in the wilderness were in the land. The people who had been slaves and then pilgrims, and then the 40-year community of the wilderness road. These people were home, in the land that had been promised, settled, at rest. The Lord had given them rest. This rest is the destination of the whole story of the Exodus and the wilderness years. Not the leaving of Egypt, that was the beginning. Not the crossing of the sea, that was the liberation. Not the mountain and the covenant, those were the formation. Not the 40 years of manna and cloud, those were the preparation. The rest at the end in the land, settled and established and no longer in motion. This is the destination. And it was given, not achieved by their own strength, not arrived at by their own navigation. Given, as the land itself had been given, as the passage through the sea had been given, as the manna had been given, as the strength to Joshua had been given, as the word to each generation along the way had been given. Given, all of it, given and received. The crossing of the Jordan became, in the long memory of Israel, what the crossing of the sea had been, a defining event, a moment to which the people returned in telling and in song and in the practice of memory. The two crossings are related. Both involve water that parts. Both involve dry ground where water had been. Both are crossings from one kind of life to another, from slavery to freedom, from wilderness to land. The first generation crossed the sea. The second generation crossed the Jordan. The ancient scribes and poets who reflected on these events drew the connection deliberately. They saw the Jordan crossing as a completion. The second great water crossing that bookended the wilderness journey. The sea at the beginning, the Jordan at the end. Water divided at the start of the 40 years, and water divided again at the close. The same power that had opened the sea had held back the Jordan. The people who crossed the Jordan had not seen the sea crossing themselves. They had inherited it in story. But now they had their own crossing, their own dry ground, their own 12 stones. The story was given to them embodied, not only in words. They had walked through it. The 12 stones at Gilgal would be the future occasion for telling. When your children ask, "What do these stones mean?" then you will tell them. The stones created the question created the telling kept the memory alive, and the living memory kept the identity of the people alive, the awareness of who they were, where they had come from, what they had been carried through, what they had been given. This is the function of memorial in the ancient understanding. Not nostalgia, not the wish that things were as they had been, but the transmission of identity across time, the handing of a story from one generation to the next, through objects and practices and questions asked and answered. What do these stones mean? They mean the Jordan stopped. The Lord cut off its waters before the Ark of the Covenant. We pass through on dry ground. This is who we are. This is what happened. These stones remember it, even when we forget. Joshua grew old. The ancient text tells us this plainly, in the way it tells most things, without sentimentality, without elaboration. He grew old and well advanced in years. He had been a young man when he served Moses. He had been middle-aged, perhaps, when he led the crossing of the Jordan. And now, after all the years of the campaigns and the settlements and the allotting of the land to the tribes, he was old. He gathered the people for what the ancient account describes as his final addresses. 2 long speeches in which he gathered up everything he had seen and done and been part of, and offered it back to the people as a final testimony before he died. In those speeches, he rehearsed the whole story, from Abraham, from the crossing of the sea, from the wilderness years, from the Jordan and the campaigns in the land. He brought all of it together and set it before the people and said, Look at what has been done, not by us, by the one who promised and kept the promise, who swore and did not fail. And then he called the people to choose, to decide deliberately and consciously to be the people they had been formed to be. Choose this day whom you will serve. And the people said, The Lord our God we will serve, and his voice we will obey. And Joshua died. He was buried in the hill country, on the land that had been given to him as his inheritance. He was, the ancient text says, 110 years old. 110 years. A life that had encompassed the whole of the wilderness generation. Born in Egypt perhaps, grown up as a slave, escaped in the Exodus, lived through 40 years of the wilderness, crossed the Jordan, led the campaigns, seen the promise fulfilled. He had lived to see not one word fail. He died in the land. He was buried in the land that had been promised to Abraham, to his grandson Jacob, to the whole community of Israel. The land was where Joshua's bones would rest. This is a particular kind of completion, to be buried in the place you were promised, to rest in the ground of the fulfillment. Let the mind come to rest in the landscape for a moment. The Jordan River, where the crossing happened, still flows. Not exactly as it flowed in Joshua's time. The river today is smaller, its waters more managed, its banks different in some places. But the river is there. The valley it runs through is there. The hills of Transjordan are there to the east, and the highlands of Canaan rise to the west, just as they did when the priests stood in the dry riverbed with the ark on their shoulders. The land that the people of Israel crossed into, the hills and valleys and plains of what the ancient texts call Canaan, and what has been called many things by many peoples across the long centuries since. This land is real, not mythological, not symbolic. Real ground, real soil, real rock and olive tree and spring water, and the particular light of that part of the world. The promise was for a real place. The fulfillment happened in a real landscape. The people who settled there were real people who planted fields and built houses and drew water from real wells. The ancient account does not float above the physical world. It is embedded in it, rooted in it, attached to specific rivers and cities and hills with specific names. The story happened somewhere, in the world, in geography that can be walked. And yet, the story also carries within it something that travels beyond the specific geography, something that is spoken to people in very different places, across very many centuries, who have found in this story of crossing and arrival a shape that their own experience recognized, the wilderness wandering that ends in the land, the long road that arrives finally at the promised place, the generation that carries the promise without seeing its fulfillment and passes it to the next generation, who passes it to the next, until the generation that actually crosses. These patterns recur in human experience. They are not identical to the Israelite experience. Nothing is identical to it, but the shape is recognizable. The long waiting, the threshold crossed, the arrival that turns out to be real, the rest that was promised and given. The story of Joshua has traveled with people who needed it, people in exile who needed to know that return was possible, people in long difficulty who needed to hear that not one word fails, people who were tired of wandering and needed the image of the land ahead of the river, of the crossing, of the dry ground underfoot, of the first camp in the promised place. The word that gathers up the fulfillment of the promise, rest, is worth staying with for a little while. in the quiet of this hour. Rest, in the ancient understanding, was not simply the cessation of activity. It was something positive, the state of being in the right place, doing the right thing, settled in the purpose for which you were made. The rest of the seventh day was not an empty day. It was a day that corresponded to the rest of God at the completion of creation. The rest that follows and completes the work, that declares the work done. The rest given to Israel in the land was this kind of rest. Not laziness, not the exhaustion that simply collapses, but the rest of arrival, of being at last where you were meant to be, of inhabiting the place that was given to you and discovering that it fits, that the life you were made for can actually be lived here. This is a rest that includes living, working, planting, building, raising children, all the ordinary activities of human life. But they are done from a place of settledness, of having arrived. The wilderness was not rest. The wilderness was provision and guidance and formation and movement and the patient, extraordinary sustaining of a people who were not yet home. All of it was necessary. All of it was given. But it was not rest. The land was rest. There is something in this that speaks gently to the texture of ordinary human experience. Most of us spend significant portions of our lives in something that feels more like the wilderness than the land. In between places, moving through difficulty, not yet arrived at what we are moving toward, sustained perhaps, but not yet settled, provided for, but not yet home. The story of the crossing offers something to such a time, not a promise that the wilderness will end tomorrow, or that the crossing is just around the next bend, but the assurance that the wilderness is not the final word, that the land exists, that the crossing comes, that the promise is kept. Not one word fails. The wilderness was real, the crossing was real, the land was real, the rest was given. And so the story stands in the quiet of the night, as it has stood across 3,000 years, a testimony to arrival, to fulfillment, to the rest that comes at the end of the wandering. Let the imagination come to rest in the land, now that the crossing is complete. The camp at Gilgal, the first evening in the promised land, after the 12 stones have been set up and the people have settled. The Jordan is behind them, its sound audible perhaps from the camp, the river running full again, the sight of the dry crossing already covered by the returning water. The hills of Canaan are ahead of them, visible in the late afternoon light. The limestone ridges that run north and south through the land, their pale rock glowing in the warm light of the setting sun. The plains of Jericho stretch between the river and the hills, flat, wide, green where it is watered. The first agricultural land the wilderness-born generation has ever been close to. The air is different from the desert air they have known. More moisture in it, perhaps. The land west of the Jordan receives more rainfall than the Transjordanian plateau. There are trees that are not acacia trees. There are plants that are not the sparse scrub of the desert wilderness. They are in a different place. The children who were born in the wilderness and have never known any home but the camp. These children are looking at this new landscape for the first time. The hills, the trees, the wider sky over a different horizon. What they do with this newness is not recorded in the ancient text. The ancient account moves quickly through the historical events, not pausing for the interior experience of the people. But it is not difficult to imagine something of what they might have felt, the mixture of wonder and uncertainty that belongs to being in a place you have always moved toward, but never been. The sense of threshold passed, of something new under the feet. The manna will not come tomorrow. They know this now, or will know it by morning. The provision of the wilderness is complete. The provision of the land is beginning. Tomorrow they will eat bread made from the grain of the land, and the day after, and the day after that. The daily miracle will give way to the daily ordinary. The extraordinary sustenance of the wilderness will be replaced by the agricultural rhythms of sowing and harvest, of rain in its season and fruit in its time. This too is a kind of gift, the gift of ordinariness, of life that does not require daily miracle, because the ordinary provision of a fruitful land is available. The 12 stones stood at Gilgal for a long time. The ancient account does not tell us exactly when they were removed, or whether they eventually were. For the generations immediately after the crossing, they were there. A physical presence in the landscape, an arrangement of river stones set in a specific place for a specific purpose. Children grew up near them. Parents brought children to them. The question was asked, and the answer was given. The crossing was told. The dry ground was described. The priest standing with the ark in the riverbed, while all the people passed, were narrated, every year, every season, to whoever was ready to hear. The stones held the story in their silence, made of nothing special. Stones from a riverbed, indistinguishable from any other stones except for where they had come from, and why they had been carried, and what they had been placed here to remember. This is the genius of the stone memorial. It does not tell the story itself. It cannot. Stones do not speak. It creates the occasion for the story to be told. It makes the telling natural, inevitable. When the child asks, the telling begins, and the telling is the living form of what the stones can only point toward. We are a long way in time from those stones at Gilgal. If they stood, they are long since scattered or buried or carried off by the ordinary erosion of centuries. The specific arrangement that Joshua set is gone, but the story is here. The telling has not stopped. The crossing has been told and retold in how many languages, by how many people, across how many centuries. And it arrives in this quiet hour, into this listening. As alive as it was on the first evening, the children ask their parents, "What do those stones mean?" They mean the Jordan stopped. They mean the people crossed on dry ground. They mean the promise was kept. This telling is its own kind of stone, set here in the night to point toward what has happened and what it means. Let the story settle now, the way a people settles after crossing, the way the camp settles in the evening of the first night in the new place. The Jordan is behind them. The crossing is complete. The 12 stones stand in the gathering dark of the Gilgal camp. Stones from the riverbed, brought up in the arms of the 12 representatives, set here by Joshua's hands, marking this place and this event and this arrival. The priests have come up from the river. The ark is in its place in the center of the camp. The cloud is on it, still present, still the sign of the presence that has been with the people since the night they left Egypt. The same presence, in the same form, in the first camp in the land. The people are resting. The long day of crossing is over. The feet that walked on dry ground in the middle of the Jordan are resting now. The arms that carried what they carried, the children and the household goods and the stones from the riverbed, are still. Tonight, for the first time, the people sleep in the land. Let the word rest, the word that gathers up the whole of what has been given and received. The Lord gave them rest. Not one word failed. Let these words be present in the imagination tonight, not as a lesson or a demand, but simply as words that were said at the end of a very long journey by the ancient text that tells it. Words that describe what happened when the promise was fulfilled and the people arrived and settled and discovered that the land they had been moving toward was real, and that living in it was possible, and that the rest they had been promised was genuinely given. The wandering is complete in the story. The wilderness is behind them. The river has been crossed. The first camp is set. The stones are arranged. Let the breath slow now. Let the body rest where it is. Let the weight of today's particular journey, whatever distance it has covered, whatever difficulty it has held, settle gently downward, the way the people settled on the western bank of the Jordan. You are somewhere in the middle of your own story tonight, perhaps in a season of wilderness, sustained but not yet arrived, perhaps at the edge of a crossing, aware that the water is before you and the way through is not yet clear, perhaps already in something that feels more like the land than the wilderness, settling into the rest that comes with arrival. Wherever you are in the story, the night is here now, and the night is its own kind of provision, the dark hours given to the body and the mind as their own particular rest, their own Sabbath, their own daily crossing into the renewal that sleep offers. The pillar of fire is in its place, the presence that does not sleep, that watches through the hours of darkness over all who are resting. It was there in the wilderness camp, and it is there in the first camp in the land, and it is there in every camp, in every night, in every place where people who are held by the covenant lie down to sleep. Not one word fails. Not one night is unguarded. Not one person who belongs to the story is left outside it. The Jordan is quiet now. The water has returned to its banks, covering the dry ground where the people walked. The 12 stones at Gilgal stand in the dark. The hills of Canaan are shapes in the night sky. The manna will not come in the morning, but the morning will come. The grain of the land will be there. The new provision of the new season will be given. For now there is only the night, the rest, the camp at its first rest in the promised place. Be still. The wandering is over. Sleep. Amen.